Welcome to an introduction to the cognitive information processing theory. While behavior theories focus on overt behavior such as writing or demonstrating how to solve math problems, cognitive theories focus on how stimuli received from the five senses are processed internally before action is taken. While there are a variety of information processing theories, the dominant views include a stage theory, a levels of processing theory, a parallel distributed processing theory, and a connectionist theory. The stage theory proposes that external stimuli are processed in three stages. In the first stage, labeled short-term sensory store or sensory memory, information is processed very quickly and then either initially processed and moved into short-term memory or forgotten. The key processing activity is attention. A stimulus activating the sensory receptors in the eye will only last about 1/2 second, while a stimulus activating the sensory receptors in the ear will last about 3 seconds. If attention is given to the external stimulus, there is an initial processing where the encoding of that stimulus is combined with information stored in long-term memory and pulled into short-term or working memory. At that point, it is either repeated, acted on, or forgotten. Without repetition, information is likely to remain retrievable for only 15 to 20 seconds. However, the learning goal is to have information stored in long-term memory on a relatively permanent basis. That requires some sort of coding and elaboration. The levels of processing theory of information processing has a slightly different view. Rather than hypothesizing three different stages with three different types of storage, the levels of processing theory proposes one overarching type of processing: elaboration. The developers of this theory propose three different levels of elaboration. The first is shallow processing that involves coding the object in terms of its physical properties. For example, do the words all start with capital letters? The second level is labeled intermediate processing that involves coding the object in terms of how it sounds or phonemic coding. For example, what is the difference between shallow and structural? Finally, deep processing is done semantically, with an emphasis on the meaning of the object. Thus, the levels of processing theory proposed that it was the type of elaboration done that impacted whether or not new information was readily retrievable. The parallel distributed processing theory critiqued both the stage theory and the levels of elaboration theory for proposing that all information processing was done in a serial fashion. For example, in the original version of the stage theory proposed in the 1960s, it was thought that attention pulled what was in sensory memory, which was then maintained there through rote or maintenance rehearsal, as it was encoding into long-term memory. The levels of processing theory proposed a similar serial process. However, the parallel distributed processing theorists proposed that multiple types of processing were occurring simultaneously in a parallel manner. The stage model shown previously has incorporated the parallel processing feature of this theory. Rather than an arrow going straight from sensory memory to short-term memory, this model shows an arrow going from long-term memory to short-term memory. This indicates that what is placed in short-term memory or working memory is a combination of the stimulus that activated a sensory receptor cell and what was stored in long-term memory that might relate to that stimulus. This indicates that what is placed in short-term or working memory is a combination of the stimulus that activated a sensory receptor cell and what was stored in long-term memory that might relate to that stimulus. Think of this as a cup of tea. In the cup of water, the tea molecules and perhaps some sugar and milk. Once these are all stirred into the cup, it is very difficult to separate the ingredients into the separate components that made the tea. In the same way, what is stored in short-term memory is a composite of what was stored in sensory memory as it was combined with what was stored in long-term memory. It is very difficult at that point to separate that memory into its basic components. Another way that the parallel distributed processing theory is incorporated in this revised stage theory model is in the two arrows connecting short-term and long-term memory. This dual processing is occurring simultaneously as the individual attempt to understand what is stored in short-term memory. That is, the meaning of what is stored in short-term memory is created in the process of actively working on that memory. This is why short-term memory is often referred to as working memory. Finally, the connectivist theory advocates that memory is actually stored in networks and that the more connections that any specific piece of information has to other pieces of information, the more easily the memory will be easily retrieved. For example, we've been discussing the information processing theories of memory. We have discussed four different theories: the stage theory, the levels of processing theory, the parallel distributed processing theory, and the connectivist theory. We have said that stage theory and the levels of processing theories are similar in that they both propose that processing occurs in a serial fashion. However, the parallel distributed processing theory critiqued these two memories and proposed that information is processed simultaneously in a parallel manner rather than serially. Finally, we talked about how the connectivist theory suggests that it is not the manner in which the information was originally coded that makes the information more readily available for retrieval, but it is the number of connections that are made among the individual pieces of information. So, what does this all mean for educators? How can this information be used to guide instruction for children, or adolescents, or adults? That is the topic of Part 2 of this presentation.